Hello, and welcome to the Blue Shadow Podcast. My name is Joey. I am typically joined by Dan, but he is out today, and that leaves just me to talk to you about Deadpool and Wolverine, which I am thoroughly excited about. If you listen to us at all, we are primarily a Star Wars podcast, but we like to leave flexibility for us to talk about other things that we love. And one of those things for me is Marvel, especially anything related to the X-Men. So hopefully you can enjoy what I have to say about it. But I do want to give you a big spoiler warning. I'm going to talk about everything spoiler related for this. Not going to avoid anything. So if you haven't seen it yet, please feel free to pause this, go see it, come back and give us a listen if you're interested. So if you haven't seen it, again, spoiler warning. I'm going to dive into it now. But I do want to say before I start, I am not a movie critic. I am a fan first, and that's kind of the perspective I'm coming at this review with. Is I'm a big fan, especially of the X-Men. So that's the direction and the thought process I have going into this. As I said, I do absolutely love the X-Men. Wolverine is and always has been my favorite superhero, and I've always loved the Fox X-Men movies. From when I was a kid watching the first, three of them, all the way up through like high school and even, I think, into college, watching some of the later Fox X-Men movies. And I was kind of sad when they started to falter, and then the MCU really took off, which I do absolutely love the MCU. But they took off and they kind of left the X-Men in the dust, and it felt kind of sad for me because these are my childhood superheroes, and especially Wolverine. Logan was a wonderful ending to it, but it was still kind of like, it's just kind of dying off. And I love Deadpool and virtually anything I'd seen him in prior to even his movies releasing, like the Ultimate Alliance 2 video game, Lego Marvel Superheroes video game, the Deadpool video game, a lot of video games, if you couldn't tell. And I loved all of his movies, and I was just, very excited when this movie was announced. And I loved really almost anything that these two characters were in prior to the release of this movie and the announcement of this movie. So I went into it being incredibly excited. I like Logan a lot, but I was disappointed that it meant that Hugh Jackman's Wolverine was done. Nothing against that story, but I just want more of that. And I saw people upset about like ruining Logan's legacy, and that didn't bother me. We'll talk about how they handled that legacy, for that specific character. But for me, I was elated to have Hugh Jackman coming back. It wasn't ruining anything for me personally. And as a huge Wolverine fan, it just meant a lot to have this character back, especially with Hugh Jackman as playing him. But anyway, from the pictures, the trailers, all of the press surrounding it, I was very, very thrilled about everything going into this movie. And I have to say I was very happy with everything there. So I want to talk about the way this review is going to be structured. We're going to start out by talking about my overall thoughts. I want to talk about some key characters. And then I want to get into some of my favorite moments, and then talk about like the emotional payoff of the story and tying everything into the MCU. So that's kind of the structure. And like I said, we're going to start with my overall thoughts. I really, really, really loved it. For me, I thought that, this is like kind of a comedy first for me, and every single joke worked for me. I'm not that hard to please when it comes to comedy, but sometimes in a movie like this, it can be a lot. But I think balancing Deadpool's, constantly talking, constantly making jokes with Wolverine serving as a straight man was just a fantastic way to approach something like this. I know this is done in the comics several times before, but it feels fully realized on the screen in a way that felt new to me, which was really exciting. And that the use of the TVA was such a fun way to really tie the MCU to this Fox X-Men universe. And I know the idea of the multiverse has already been established, but it was logical for this. But I thought it was executed really well and smoothly in a way that made it feel very natural and not like things were being forced in. I love the premise that leads to Deadpool and Wolverine being sent to the Void. And I love all the events that happen in the Void, because it makes total sense that they would be there given the nature that the MCU is taking about their multiverse and the way that timelines kind of work. I thought all the adventures in the Void were amazing, and we'll talk about those more specifically. I really loved the overall story relating to the rogue TVA agent Paradox and how he's actively going against what we saw, the vision of the TVA that was established in Loki Season 2. And I've seen some criticism thus far that the movie doesn't have a substantial plot. And, as I mentioned, I'm not a movie critic. I'm a fan. But this movie felt so true to a comic book story in every sense of the word. And it maybe could have been more streamlined. Maybe they could have cut some things or added some things. But for me, this story did everything that it set out to. And I don't think that having a full-fledged, like, an incredibly streamlined and efficient plot is what this movie was trying to do. And if I had to, give one thing that I wished was different in this movie, and even that is kind of pushing it for me to say that I was wishing for it, but I wish that the characters from Deadpool 1 and 2 were used more. They're used very minimally here, and for me, seeing this, it kind of highlights just how little Vanessa is in the stories of Deadpool 2 and 3, despite her presence having a very, very strong, like, forward-pushing force on Wade Wilson. And this movie had a lot to do, and it used its time really wisely to tell the story that it was working on. But I would have also loved to see more time with those characters, especially Vanessa. That's kind of my biggest thing that I wish had happened, but that's not necessarily the nature of what the story was trying to do, so I understand why they weren't. Overall, I really loved this movie. I thought it was incredibly fun, very, very funny, and it delivered on exactly what it promised leading up to it. I know sometimes movies, maybe MCU or otherwise, you see a trailer and you're like, this is kind of not what I expected after you leave the movie theater, but for me, this was everything and more that I wanted going into and then coming out of the movie. With that, I want to transition into talking about some of the key characters in the movie. And the first for me there is Deadpool. As with the other two movies, I felt like Deadpool managed to perfectly balance both humor and heart. His motivations for the story, especially relating to like his split from Vanessa, was a little jarring for me, but mainly because a lot of it happened off screen, but I still grasped it, I understood it, it made sense. Given the relationship of those two characters over the first two movies, it just was kind of like, oh, wow, this is happening. All right. But if we set that aside, I love the idea of Deadpool wanting to serve a higher purpose because he's typically presented as a goofy character with no real aspirations of being a hero beyond his immediate needs for him and the people he cares about. But as I mentioned, I wish we could have seen more of the original cast, but the rationale that Wade needs to go off in order to save them gave a really strong motivation for what occurred in this movie. And I think the emotional journey that Wade goes on here feels very earned with him, all the lessons he's learned over the first two movies and this one brought him to a point where he was willing to sacrifice himself to save his family. And it also kind of showed how the power of his newly formed friendship with Wolverine was able to save them both and then allow him to enjoy time with both Wolverine and his family. For Deadpool, I always loved the humor surrounding it, and for me, my favorite kind of gags were Dogpool, the idea of him repeatedly saying educated wish instead of lying, pretty much every single Disney or MCU joke, and I was absolutely shocked that they allowed him to say some of the stuff, that, specifically thinking of like him speaking to Wolverine and saying you're entering a kind of a low point, which honestly, I'm pretty happy with the MCU at the moment, but I still think those jokes were darn funny, and there's so much more, and you've seen it, assuming you're listening to this. So funny. I really loved it. And it all really worked for me. Nothing really stood out to me as like, oh my God, that joke is not funny for me at all. But, I thought it was really entertaining and I laughed the whole time. And I want to close out talking about Deadpool and transition into talking about Wolverine by mentioning their suits. I absolutely love the way they looked. For Deadpool, I thought the bright red colors kind of put on to the suit that was already fantastic from the first two movies really made it feel right out of a comic page. And I just love the bright contrast between Deadpool's bright red and Wolverine's bright yellow. Now transitioning to talk about Wolverine, which I'm so excited for. Oh my God, I've waited for as long as I can remember to see Hugh Jackman wearing a suit like this. And when I first saw the pictures of it, I feel like I nearly fainted. I definitely screamed. And after we saw this movie, I told my wife I could have watched Wolverine stand there in his comic accurate suit doing nothing but walking around, living his life for the 2-hour and 7-minute runtime of this movie. And I fully stand by that. Even more, though, than the suit just looking absolutely fantastic. I love that the suit had a thematic reasoning for being there, being that this version of Wolverine was affiliated with the X-Men, he didn't want to wear the suit that they had made for him. But we'll, kind of talk about, what's going on there a little bit later. But having that, suit really be him accepting his role as an X-Man to honor his team's memory was just fantastic. So it's like you have this cool thing you've wanted to see your whole life, or, as long as you've been an X-Men fan, and then marrying that with a real strong reason for it being there, I just thought was fantastic. And like I said, I was incredibly excited to see this suit design, and I loved it as much as I expected. And I also thought, I've seen some people saying that the cowl that comes on in the last fight didn't look great. For me, I loved it. It's something I've, again, wanted to see for a very long time. And even though I was excited about the suit, I was even more excited to have Hugh Jackman back as Wolverine. And I'm going to talk about, as I had mentioned earlier, how they honored the legacy of the original Wolverine variant from all the X-Men movies that lead up from X-Men 1 to Logan. I love that rather than them finding some sort of way to undo the ending of Logan, they kind of doubled down on the importance of that character, revealing that he's an anchor being and that his whole world, which would be the Fox X-Men world, would be destroyed because that anchor being had died. And I thought this paid an incredible amount of respect to the original version of Wolverine, but allowed us to, take this new Wolverine in a new direction. And I thought that, the massive fight scene with Wolverine's skeleton was a little bit much, for how long it went on and how much detail they went into with killing with Wolverine's bones. But I loved it. And it still kind of serves the spirit of what I'm saying there. It's like that ending is that ending. It had such huge ramifications that the events of this movie then have to happen. I want to next talk about finding a Wolverine. There's that whole montage that, as, again, I'm an X-Men fan, a Marvel fan, I was so excited. I thought that the montage was absolutely amazing. And my favorite, Wolverine variants that we saw were the brown suit versus Hulk Wolverine, the Henry Cavill Wolverine. Poking fun at DC is always kind of entertaining for me. I thought the Age of the Apocalypse one with one hand was really fun because I had that action figure as a kid. And the comic accurate short Wolverine was hysterical. And I think that's funny because it's sometimes a criticism people throw at Hugh Jackman. But I loved the idea that this Wolverine that we spend most of our time with in this movie, the worst Wolverine, I think that this version of the character really distills down the main lessons that Wolverine learns in the comics, the original X-Men movies, and it just really worked so well for me. And then this lesson being that he needed to stop resisting, that he wanted to be a part of the X-Men, and show that he actually cares about each other member of his team. And this Wolverine never got a chance to learn that lesson because he left them, make it sound like because he left them to go to the bar, maybe he went off and just happened to come back drunk, but he, came back to all of the X-Men being killed by anti-mutant humans. And he kind of says that he went on a killing spree and ruined the name of the X-Men. In his universe, he had killed people who were guilty and innocent. And I thought that this concept was such a good way to have a new and very compelling Logan added to the story. This Logan is less of a true superhero than Wolverine is as we know him. And this concept allows him to form a bond with Deadpool and learn a very similar lesson to what Deadpool's learning. And for me, that was the core of the movie here. And it made me immediately feel like Wolverine's inclusion was worthwhile. I don't think they needed to justify having Wolverine there in the first place at all. But for me, the emotional core of this movie was showing how these two characters who typically who have a very different path getting to this point and typically have very different lessons they learn out of their stories, and putting them on the same path. That was really, really interesting. As far as other things, I thought the banter between Deadpool and Wolverine was fantastic. I thought all of Wolverine's jokes and slowly watching him accept who he is rather than running away from who he can be was fantastic. And I thought that, just again, this version of Wolverine was a fantastic inclusion, and it delivered on everything I, as a huge Wolverine and X-Men fan, wanted. I could, in fact, sit here and talk about Wolverine all day, if you couldn't tell, but I will stop myself and move on to one more thing about him that'll then allow me to transition into the next character, and that is his relationship with X-23. And I thought that X-23, though playing a small role here in terms of screen time, she had such a powerful inclusion for Wolverine's story. As with most of the stuff in this movie, I thought her action scenes were fantastic. But I'm specifically referring to the thematic reasoning for having her be in this story. My favorite part, of her and Wolverine's relationship here was their conversation by the fire, and you could kind of feel her admiration and respect for her Logan. And she, despite the worst Wolverine, quote, quote, the one we follow in this movie, saying he's nothing like hers, she can kind of see that he has the potential to be just the same thing if he chose to do that. And I thought that Logan, the movie, again, was very interesting. And I thought it was an interesting approach to the character of Wolverine. And I love the inclusion of X-23 and the way that they did all of that. And I thought bringing her in here allows you to kind of pull some of the emotions you had when you were watching that movie in with you and add some extra weight to the scene, which is already fantastic. And I also like that this scene allowed us to see Wolverine telling X-23 about his X-Men and, you know, also pulling in our attachment to those characters, hearing Scott and Storm and all of that. Like, it just really made the scene have a heavy, heavy weight to it as a big X-Men fan. And that was very, very, very fantastic for me. I have some other things I want to say about X-23, but we're going to talk about that kind of at the end. I do now want to dive into Cassandra Nova. I don't have a clever transition here like I did for the other ones, but I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about our villains of the movie, starting with Cassandra Nova. I thought Cassandra Nova was kind of a crazy Marvel inclusion, being Professor X's twin sister that he kind of punched out in the womb. And it kind of made sense, though, as to why she might be banished here, why she wouldn't have been a part of the Fox X-Men universe. And I thought her motivations were clear. Her powers were really cool and creepy, very reflective of what happens in the comics. And I kind of, for me, one wish thing that I knew the chances were low, but when she was reaching around in Wolverine's mind, I was kind of hoping we'd see a memory of all the Fox X-Men in their comic accurate costumes. But that's a pipe dream, and we don't need that. We don't need to introduce something that they never said they were going to do. But I love that Cassandra was essentially like an anti-Professor X. And I think this was able to help Wolverine, along with, making his connection with X-23, help him move past his struggles and kind of apply the lessons that Professor X was teaching him. And I thought that was a really special way to view a villain in this movie. But unfortunately for me, though, Cassandra felt very much like a lot of other MCU villains, in that being she has a motivation directly related to the plot that makes a lot of sense, but is quickly killed off with, really no way of returning in the future. If you've listened to us at all for any of our, Star Wars coverage, I'm not the biggest proponent of killing off characters. I don't think it's always the strongest way of concluding their story. And I would have loved to see Cassandra Nova and other MCU villains in general survive past their initial movie so that they could play a role in other stories rather than introducing a new villain in every story. I know we have our Thanoses, our Kangs, our Doctor Dooms, and all of that, but I think, having these smaller villains survive could be powerful. And speaking of surviving villains, we did see Paradox survive. I, again, mentioned that the idea of having a rogue TVA agent trying to prune timelines without the higher-ups knowing was a very interesting proposition. And I thought it was a really fun villain because it's someone you kind of wanted to hate. Cassandra you can kind of empathize with. You had no redeeming factors about Paradox. And, all I have to say is, kind of echoing what I said about Cassandra is I hope that we get to see him wreak more havoc on the TVA in the future. Those are kind of the core characters I really wanted to talk about, but I wanted to move into some of my favorite moments. And there are an absolute ton, so I'm going to kind of control myself, but I want to start by talking about the Human Torch. I thought that this was such a fun inclusion. If you couldn't tell by the timeline that I'm saying I'm growing up and all of that, I love the Fantastic Four movies that I watched growing up. And I was excited to see this inclusion, and I like that the Human Torch kind of leaned into his, trash-talking and troublemaking tendencies. And I thought the misdirect from it being Captain America was such a fun idea. And you can tell that Chris Evans didn't really lose his spark for playing this character. I want to talk about the fight scenes relating to Deadpool and Wolverine now. I thought all of them were fantastic. First, talking about the two where they fight each other. First at the Fox logo, and then in the car. I thought that there was something really fun about this, and seeing these characters fight in a way that you've seen in the comics before was such a great thing to be able to sit in a movie theater and see. And I love the concept of having two characters that aren't really enemies and can't truly hurt one another fight. It kind of felt like having a playful argument with a friend, but taken to a whole new level. So I thought all of the fight scenes relating to these guys were incredible. I also wanted to say how much I love these two fighting against the Deadpool Corps, and I thought that just a great way to conclude the movie without having a major fight against one villain, but rather doing that. And the use of Peter there to kind of be the end was really entertaining. The next thing I want to talk about And, kind of the last thing for cool things is, and favorite moments, was the resistance against Cassandra. Oh dear. I was so excited about this. Seeing Elektra and Blade were incredibly unexpected for me and super cool. I watched those movies growing up as well. Wasn't as attached to those characters, but the thing that got me over the moon excited was Channing Tatum's Gambit. He was, originally a cast and announced at a San Diego Comic-Con, and it just ended up not coming to fruition, really. And I was really sad that didn't happen because I love the character of Gambit. I had just recently rewatched the X-Men animated series, watched X-Men 97, and I realized what a fantastic character Gambit is. And my wife had seen the movies but not watched the shows before. She was like, why is he not in the movies? He's fantastic. And this kind of felt like we got to see that fully realized. The comic Gambit, but, here in actual movie form. And I thought that, he was used for some comedic moments, but it really did allow us to see Gambit in true form. And I thought it also provided a really cool way to see his powers. It seemed, exactly what you'd expect or want from Gambit powers. So I was just enamored and amazed by that. I thought that they also provided a means of explaining maybe why Gambit might not have been in the Fox X-Men movies in universe, meaning that maybe he was born there. Maybe his mother was pruned and he was born in the void. So he never had the opportunity to be in those movies. I thought the fight scene relating to all of these characters, at Cassandra's base was fantastic. But I do wish we got to see it in a little more detail. It all happened really fast. And I wanted to see, maybe more X-23 and more Gambit doing their thing. For me, before we talk about my overall thoughts and what might come next, I wanted to talk about the emotional payoff of this movie. I'm always surprised by how much emotional payoff there is in the Deadpool movies. For something that's constantly making jokes and being crude and all that, there's a lot of actual nuance to these stories that are really, really fantastic. And for me, we see Deadpool here earn his higher purpose that he's looking for. And his reward for that is rekindling his romance with Vanessa and getting to be with the people he loves, which includes X-23 and Wolverine. And I thought it was interesting that Wolverine didn't really get to have his universe fixed, and B-52 says that because it led his universe and what happened there led him to be the person that could help save that one that they were in. And I love that Wolverine was able to become a fully realized Wolverine, not the worst Wolverine. Deadpool even calls him the best Wolverine. And I love that he, got to get this emotional reward of friendship with Deadpool and getting to form a bond with X-23. I know I'm a little bit of a drama queen, but the Logan and X-23 being together in this context did kind of have me tearing up because that is the X-23 that we know from, that experience in Logan. So to see that was fantastic. For me, I now want to talk about bringing Deadpool and Wolverine into the larger MCU. I thought this was such a clever and fun way to do it. And based on the ending, it was such an interesting way to bring Deadpool, but not only Deadpool, but Wolverine and X-23 into the MCU. And it kind of seems like it's ending a little bit adjacent to the MCU, which, might be good. And we'll kind of talk about that in a second. But I thought the jokes were fantastic. It kind of walked the line of taking the MCU seriously, but also poking fun. And as a fan of these movies from the beginning, I was enormously excited to see Deadpool not feel like an underdog as a movie and that it had to prove itself. That's kind of the perspective that those movies had when they were kind of coming out, especially the first one. And it was just nice to see Deadpool kind of feel like he is the big hero. And it's, really earned, I feel like. I want to talk about two dangling threads. The first is the Thor and Deadpool scene when he was in the TVA. I'm not sure what it could be. Could it be some sort of sacrifice that Deadpool makes and him dying potentially? I have some sort of suspicion that it's some kind of joke with Thor and Deadpool recreating a scene from Thor: The Dark World. I don't know. Kind of fun. Hinting that Deadpool will be back in the future. And I do think that the ending of this movie kind of leaves the door open for Deadpool, somehow Hugh Jackman's Wolverine and Daphne Keene's X-23 to make a return without actually being directly placed in the MCU sacred timeline, all of that. And for me, that's a perfect way to include these characters in the MCU multiverse saga without them necessarily bleeding into or overtaking every movie. I think and kind of hope that the X-Men, when they enter the MCU in their true form, that they are played by new characters, but I love the idea that we can have our MCU X-Men, but also have Deadpool and Wolverine played by Hugh Jackman kind of off on their own. And wrapping things up, overall, if you couldn't tell, I absolutely adored this movie. I am by no means, as I've said, a movie critic, but I'm a Marvel fan and an X-Men fan. And this movie felt like it was specifically made for someone like me, and I'm absolutely grateful for that. And I'm not sure if the emotional beats would hit as hard for someone who isn't as attached to those characters. But for me, having a send-off to the 20th Century Fox X-Men universe that meant so much to me growing up, and even planting the seeds to have part of that world still live on in the MCU means the world to me as a fan. With that, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. If you are new here, please feel free to subscribe. We're a relatively new podcast/YouTube channel. We often cover Star Wars, but we'll periodically, add some extra stuff like video games or Marvel. Again, like I said, please feel free to give us a subscription or like on YouTube at Blue Shadow or on your podcast platform of choice. Consider giving us a follow on Twitter at Blue Shadow Pod or on Instagram at Blue Shadow Podcast, and consider looking at our Facebook page. With that, thank you so much for listening. It's very much appreciated, and we will see you next time.